A mind-brain matter model consistent with quantum physics and unidentified flying object phenomena. Thomas E. Bearden. Prepared for the 1979 Mutual Unidentified Flying Object Network Annual Symposium. Approved for public release. Distribution unlimited. Keywords continue on reverse side if necessary and identify by block number. Action, amplification of virtual state, an energy, anti-radiation systems, Arab-Israeli war, Aristotelian logic, binding energy, biology, biological transmutation, biosystems, cattle mutilations, causality, change, coherent superposition, Cold War, collective unconscious, complementarity. Abstract, continue on reverse side if necessary and identify by block number. The author introduces a speculative model of mind and matter and their interaction that is consistent with the experimental basis of physics, and which offers mechanisms for paranormal phenomena of all types, including unidentified flying object phenomena. Certain conclusions are reached by a new fourth law of logic, which is briefly described and summarized. A new photon interaction model of quantized observable change is also presented. Keywords concluded. Conscious mind, consciousness, contacts, Cuban Missile Crisis, death transmission, dematerialization, detection, diffusion, dream analysis, electromagnetic field, electromagnetism, electron current dissolution, ether theory, flying saucers, foundation of logic, foundation of mathematics, foundation of physics, fourth law of logic, frames, free energy devices, free will, ghost rockets, gravitational field, hyperframes, hyperspace, hyperspace howitzer, inception, intent, interpretation of physics, Jungian psychology, Kirlian photography, kindling, layers of unconsciousness, Loch Ness monster, logic, many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, magic windows, mass, materialization, matter measurement, metaphysics, microwave radiation, Moray amplifier, negative entropy, neutrino, nonlinear thermodynamics, objective state, observable state, observation, orthogonal frames, paradox, particles, particle beams, particle beam weapons, perception, philosophy, photon, photoreactivation. Photon interaction, physical phenomena, positive ions, Prigogine effect, primate dominance, protons, psychokinesis, Fick-energetics, psychology, psychotronics, quantum, quantum change, quantum field theory, quantum geometrodynamics, quantum physics, radionics, reality, relativity, Sasquatch, simultaneity, simultaneous observers, spacetime, speed of light, strong force, subquantum, superspace, thought, thought forms, thresher, time, transmutation, tulpoids, two-slit experiment, unidentified. Flying object phenomena, unidentified flying object phenomena waves, ultraviolet light, uncertainty principle, unconscious mind, virtual modulation, virtual particle, virtual photon, virtual state, virtual temperature, Yom Kippur War, zero-point energy. Abstract concluded. A solution to the problem of the nature of mind is generated using the author's fourth law of logic, and a seven-dimensional hyperspatial physical model of a living biosystem is developed. Using this basic model, an infinite-dimensional cotemporal hyperspatial model of the physical universe complete with all its life forms is constructed. Levels of unconsciousness, including the collective human species unconscious, emerge naturally as types of crosstalk between hyperframes. A natural set of relations between thought forms, neutrinos, photons, and particles emerges from the model. These relations allow transformation between thought energy, neutrinos, virtual photons, and material particles by time coherent collection. The author's calculation of basic amplifier theory for this transformation process is pointed out, as is an actual device, the Moray amplifier, believed to have worked on this principle. By the author's formula, the psychokinetic power of a mind level increases exponentially as a number of biosystem stages involved. At the level of the collective human species unconscious, the psychokinesis is sufficient to materialize symbolic tulpoids, thought forms, given a sufficient stress stimulus in large groups. Using the Cold War as the major stress stimulus on mankind since World War II, the author shows that most major unidentified flying object waves in the literature precisely fit the model. Using his own collection and analysis of Soviet psychotronic weapon development, the author is also able to fit into model the several thousand paranormal and bizarre cattle mutilations that have occurred in the United States since 1973. Thomas E. Bearden, Master Scientist of Nuclear Engineering. A nuclear engineer, war games analyst, and military tactician, Lieutenant Colonel, now dead, Thomas E. Bearden has over 24 years' experience in air defense systems, tactics, and operations, technical intelligence, nuclear weapons employment, computerized war games, and military systems requirements. He was with the Alabama division of a large aerospace company, where he was involved in developing and analyzing countermeasures to anti-radiation missiles for the Patriot, improved Hawk, and Roland United States Army missile systems, and in computerized air defense war games and countermeasure studies. Lieutenant Colonel Bearden obtained an Master Science in Nuclear Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a Bachelor Science in Mathematics from Northeast Louisiana University. He is also a graduate of the United States Army Command and General Staff College and several United States Army artillery and missile schools. He has had direct experience with tube artillery and with the Ajax, Hercules, Hawk, and Patriot missile systems and directed the production of technical intelligence on Soviet SAM systems for the United States Army Department of Defense. Tom holds a Sandan, third-degree black belt, in Yasiikan Aikido, is a singer, guitarist, and songwriter, member of Mensa, Society for Investigation of the Unexplained, Vestigia, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and is on the board of governors of the American Association of Metascience. In addition, he was Alabama director for the Association of Distinguished American Scientists and a member of the United States Psychotronics Association. He also edits Specula, Journal of the American Association of Metascience. Presently a mutual unidentified flying object network advisor on nuclear engineering, Lieutenant Colonel Bearden is primarily active as a theorist on unidentified flying objects, parapsychological and paranormal phenomena, and psychotronics. He is the author of a book, The Excalibur Briefing, Strawberry Hill Press, 616 44th Avenue, San Francisco, California 94121, 1979, and numerous other papers dealing with these subjects. Abstract. The author introduces a speculative model of mind and matter and their interaction that is consistent with the experimental basis of physics, and which offers mechanisms for paranormal phenomena of all types, including unidentified flying object phenomena. Certain conclusions are reached by a new fourth law of logic, which is briefly described and summarized. A new photon interaction model of quantized observable change is also presented. A solution to the problem of the nature of mind is generated, using the author's fourth law of logic, and a seven-dimensional hyperspatial physical model of a living biosystem is developed. Using this basic model, an infinite-dimensional cotemporal hyperspatial model of the physical universe complete with all its life forms is constructed. Levels of unconsciousness, including the collective human species unconscious, emerge naturally as types of crosstalk between hyperframes. A natural set of relations between thought forms, neutrinos, photons, and particles emerges from the model. These relations allow transformation between thought energy, neutrinos, virtual photons, and material particles by time-coherent collection. The author's calculation of basic amplifier theory for this transformation process is pointed out, as is an actual device, the Moray amplifier, believed to have worked on this principle. By the author's formula, the psychokinetic power of a mind level increases exponentially as the number of biosystem stages involved. At the level of the collective human species unconscious, the psychokinesis is sufficient to materialize symbolic tulpoids, thought forms, given a sufficient stress stimulus in large groups. Using the Cold War as the major stress stimulus on mankind since World War II, the author shows that most major unidentified flying object waves in the literature precisely fit the model. Using his own collation and analysis of Soviet psychotronic weapon development, the author is also able to fit into the model the several thousand paranormal and bizarre cattle mutilations that have occurred in the US since 1973. A mind-brain matter model consistent with quantum physics and unidentified flying object phenomena. Thomas E. Bearden, M.S., Nuclear Engineering. With special drawings by Hal Crawford. In this paper we introduce a model of mind and matter and their interaction that is consistent with the entire experimental basis of physics, and which offers mechanisms for paranormal phenomena of all types, including UFO phenomena. The model is speculative since certain conclusions drawn by the author from quantum mechanics and other sources are not generally held by most scientists. Certain conclusions are reached by a new fourth law of logic advanced by the author and not yet generally accepted by the scientific community at large. Some principles necessary to understanding the model are as follows. Principles. A detector detects only internal changes. A triode, for example, detects only a change on its grid. Specifically, it knows nothing of any changes in the external circuit. Similarly, our minds detect only their own internal changes. Mind stuff, in the sense of changes, is all anyone ever experiences. An instrument also detects only its own internal change. All measurement is spatial ultimately. Instruments are made of mass, and mass is a spatial, length cubed, thing. Mass thus can only detect its own changes. Specifically, mass can be expressed dimensionally as length cubed multiplied by a time quanta equals length cubed. Since mass is a time derivative of length cubed multiplied by time, spacetime, then that is what it does. Mass may be said to time differentiate length cubed multiplied by time, spacetime, yielding a spatial detection and destroying time in the process. For this reason, time is not an observable in quantum mechanics. Time is never measured or detected, but only inferred from spatial measurement. Mind, which occupies time, is also lost in detection. Observed detected reality is only a partial reality. Observable changes occur in discrete bits of action, in quanta. The action quantum is not detectable, only pieces, derivatives, of quanta are detected. Quantum fragments occur in canonical pairs, but detecton is totally monocular. If one of the two canonical entities is totally determined, the other is totally undetermined, undetected. Quantum change occurs monocularly, one change at a time. Further, quanta do not superpose. At any one instant of time, the only thing which exists concretely is a single quantum change in progress. Length, time, energy, momentum, etc. are created and destroyed in individual bits, differentials of a quantum. The macroscopic world is like the picture on a TV tube. At any one instant of time, only a single dot is illuminated or exists. Rigorously, the only place the so-called physical world exists is in the minds, memory recall, of the living observers. Mind is objective, not subjective. Physics declares, assumes time to be objective, for there is no objective physics left if it isn't. Relativity treats time cis a dimension, compacted by the ratio factor c, where c is the velocity of light in vacuum. At the same time that physical phenomena are occurring, mental phenomena are occurring in the mind of an observer. Thus mind, mental phenomena, occupy one objective dimension, time. Mind is therefore objective, not subjective. The mind is lost in the physical detection process. Since mind occupies only a single objective dimension in common with physical phenomena, and since that dimension, time, is destroyed in the process of detection, we do not see our minds and mental phenomena, and our physical instruments do not detect them. The only thing that has, occupies, or carries time is the photon. A photon, energy quanta multiplied by time quanta, is a piece of energy welded to a piece of time with no seam in the middle. Because it carries time, then time flows at the speed of light, it can flow no faster than its carrier. Every mass in the universe is continually absorbing and emitting photons. When a photon is absorbed, it connects a time tail to the mass, giving, momentarily, length cubed multiplied by time quanta, mass time. At the next instant, a photon is emitted, carrying off the time tail and leaving behind a spatial length cubed mass. The photon itself is not detectable, only its INTE action with a mass is detectable. Figure 1 shows the raindrop model of quantized change, proposed by this author. The photon carries mind and virtual state. Virtual objects and mental objects both occupy time. Since the only thing that contains or carries time is the photon, then all mental objects and virtual objects are carried by the photon, hanging in the little piece of time welded into the photon. TB-photon interaction creates the objective state. The two-slit experiment, fundamental to all quantum mechanics, proves this. If an electron emitted in the two-slit apparatus is not struck by a photon, it interacts with both slits at once, giving the wave diffraction type distribution in electron strikes on the screen. If the electron, which is emitted as length cubed multiplied by time, mass time, not length cubed mass, is struck by a photon, the photon strips off the time tail from the electron, leaving a classical particle length cubed. The electron then goes through only one hole. Nothingness, pure vacuum, is a plenum, not an emptiness. We now know that empty vacuum itself contains enormous, mind-boggling quantities of incoherent energy, called zero-point energy. Further, we know that this energy can be observably tapped. Simply putting two conducting plates in a vacuum coheres part of the energy, and the hydrogen atom has been tapping a bit of this energy since the beginning of time, with the Lamb shift. Soviet theorists are particularly adept in this area, and Soviet experimenters have directly measured this energy cohered between two quartz plates. There are already two kinds of reality in physics, virtual and observable. The so-called observable world of changes is composed of standard-sized bricks, so to speak. If one examines a brick which is a little smaller, one finds that the small brick disappears insofar as instruments and detection are concerned, but the small brick is still quite real and useful even though it cannot be detected even in theory. Almost all particle interactions are by means of virtual particles or virtual photons. For example, virtual photons continually given off and absorbed by an electron are what creates the electric charge of the electron. If these virtual photons are destroyed or quenched, the electron is converted to a neutrino, which zips off into deep space without interaction. In this way, electrical currents in electronic systems or human nervous systems may be partially or fully quenched, without permanent damage to the system. In particle physics, many virtual particles decay into real particles, in fact, into almost any type of real, observable particle known. Little modern physics would be left without real, interactable pieces of nothing, virtual state entities. The mind may be regarded as a virtual entity. Since it shares the time dimension, it is objective, yet the mind object shares none of the physical world's spatial dimensions. We may therefore model a mind object, thought object or thought form, in a higher dimensional, seven-dimensional, space, where all its three spatial dimensions are rotated beyond any intersection with the laboratory frame, and whose time dimension is coincidental with the time dimension of the lab 4 space. In such a seven-dimensional hyperspace, the mind and its interaction with matter can be precisely and rigorously modeled. Time is the only box that contains multiple objects in the same unit. We state that, in addition, one unit of time can contain an infinite number of virtual objects or mental objects, so long as they are incoherent or sufficiently so to remain subquantum. Note that the heat diffusion into, out of, and through a macroscopic object also diffuses virtual state and mental objects. The orthodox interpretation of physics has a severe limitation: only a single observer at a time is permitted. Everett, working under the renowned John Wheeler at Princeton University, considered the problem of multiple simultaneous observers and reinterpreted physics. In this interpretation, all possibilities, no matter how weird or far out, are concretely real and exist in alternate, orthogonal universes. This physics, which is totally consistent with the entire experimental basis of physics, is so strange that most physicists cannot tolerate it. Accordingly, little or no work has been done along the lines prescribed by this physics. However, one may easily show that these alternate universes crosstalk in the virtual state, and this author has shown that a scheme exists whereby this crosstalk, and indeed the virtual state, can be directly amplified into observable state. At least one successful device along the lines of cohering the virtual state and amplifying it, T. Henry Moray's radiant energy device, has been built. There is as yet no satisfactory union of quantum mechanics and relativity. Part of the reason is the assumption of simultaneous existence of spatially separated points in a frame, by relativity. This is erroneous. Dividing the length between 2 points by c, the speed of light, gives the time separation between them for unaccelerated frames, linear conditions. The assumption of 2 clocks placed slowly at the 2 points after having been first synchronized, and then reading the same time, so to speak, is the assumption of linear, parallel conditions by 2 observers. In quantum mechanics, 2 observable changes can never be simultaneous, since quantum change occurs monocularly. Present logic is known to be incomplete, and many things are true but illogical. For example, what we call a paradox is something which is known to be true, but which can be shown to violate one or more of the 3 laws of logic. Hosts of such paradoxes are known, the simplest being change itself, that is, for a thing to change, it must become something else. Yet then how can it be itself and something else? Tool the first law, A equals A is violated if A becomes A reversed, as is the second law, A is not equal to reversed A. Further, since we are considering A to have become reversed A and therefore to be both A and reversed A, it violates the third law, which states that A or reversed A. A thing can only be one or the other, not both. Therefore change is totally illogical. Since change is all that can be detected, thought, or perceived, then all detection, thought, and perception is illogical. The problem was posed by Heraclitus, and has not been solved in thousands of years. We have taken the view that such paradoxes can easily be resolved, if one realizes that Aristotle's 3 laws of logic simply are the synthesis of perception based on the photon interaction. Primitive man formed all his concepts based on the photon interaction having occurred. Since photon interaction occurs monocularly, then present 3-law logic is monocular. In the 2-slit experiment, which according to Feynman contains the entire and the only mystery of quantum mechanics, the electron becomes a classical object if interacted with by light. If it is not interacted with by a photon, the electron is not a classical, 3-law logic, object, but is another type of entity. Since it is mass-time in that case rather than mass, it can interact in time, with multiple entity A occupying the same time slot. Thus this author has added a 4th law of logic, A1 forward, A2 reverse, where what was separated as A in time 1 and what was separated as A in time 2, are combined and totally unseparated in time 3. In time 3, then, we may say that A1 equals A2, insofar as the detection-perception process in time 3 is concerned. In other words, we treat the laws of logic simply as operational statements of the characteristics of the perception process, in which case the identity of opposites is easily understood. However, this gives us a 4-law logic, where the 4th law covers every present paradox. By applying the 4th law, at least hypothetically it is possible to solve every present paradox. The model of mind and matter and their interaction that is presented in this paper was arrived at in that manner. A 4-law logical solution of the problem of mind. In Figure 4, we show the solution to the age-old philosophical problem of mind. We start by the three-law, Cartesian, assumption that mind and matter are mutually exclusive, and we represent matter by A and mind by, as shown in the Venn diagram. To apply the fourth law, we stmply call it all of A, each and every bit of matter, and when it is all collected, the boundary is reached. At that moment, A reverse equals to reverse A, and so what we have must also represent mind. A collection of all of matter is indeed the physical universe, therefore the mind must be a physical universe. In other words, a thing can be modeled in terms of its own opposite, and mind can be modeled as a physical universe. The remaining prerequisite on our mind model is that its spatial dimensions must not intersect or coincide with the spatial dimensions of the physical universe, laboratory frame, but the time dimensions must coincide. This immediately leads to the model shown in Figure 5, where we have now shown the relationship existing between mind, neutrino, photon, and particle. In Figure 5, S represents the laboratory 3 spatial frame, that is the ordinary universe we live in. S represents electromagnetic field. An ordinary particle of mass, when turned one right angle to this universe, will intersect the lab frame in only 2 dimensions, a wave front, and thus will be perceived by a laboratory observer as a photon. We have already shown that special relativity requires this, and that it follows as a corollary to Einstein's postulate that the speed of light is the same to every observer. S represents a frame 2 orthogonal turns away from the laboratory frame, and an entity turned into this frame intersects the lab frame in a line. The candidate for this type of object at present is the neutrino. If so, neutrinos move at the speed of light squared with respect to the lab frame, not at the speed of light as is commonly supposed. Note that between frames S and S, a particle, for example, an electron, will be seen by the lab observer as a virtual photon. Thus charged particles in the lab frame communicate past the ordinary electromagnetic field in this model. Finally, an ordinary particle of mass that has orthorotated 3 full turns away from the laboratory frame will exist in frame S, and it will have a zero-dimensional intersection with the lab frame. In other words, it will be a thought or thought form. Observationally speaking, frame 3 is therefore a mind, as is each other frame that is still more turns away. Note that mind always moves at the speed of light cubed or greater with respect to the laboratory frame. In an infinite dimensional hyperspace as shown, there are a finite number of minds. Their number is very large indeed, but finite nonetheless. If a finite number of things are selected at random from an infinite number, the odds are that no two will be the same. Thus normally no true minds occupy the same mind world. Further, the hyperframes are a little more complicated than we have shown them, for we have shown the simplest case, for ease of understanding. Actually each mind world is only 3 orthogonal turns away from the laboratory frame, in nonlinear hyperspace as it is postulated to exist. Note what the process of collection, which is merely time synchronization, can accomplish. Collecting cohering mind objects, thought forms, the collectin becomes progressively virtual neutrinos, then finally neutrinos. As collection continues, the set becomes virtual photons, whereupon it is interactable with charged particles and fields. In Kirlan photography, for example, the film only records ordinary photochemical interaction. However, strongly cohering mind energy can be collected by the spark discharge, kindled into virtual photons, and affect the electromagnetic field interaction on the film. As collection continues, finally ordinary photons are reached, frame S, and thought energy has now been turned into electromagnetic energy. Certain frequencies, infrared and ultraviolet, offer much less resistance to the kindling process, and these frequencies are referred as magic windows between orthogonal frames. The visible light spectrum offers a very large resistance to such kindling, and so the visible spectrum is a strongly quenching spectrum for the effect. For this reason, kindled daylight unidentified flying objects are much rarer than are kindled nocturnal lights. If kindling continues even further, partial or full materialization occurs, thus in a few cases, materialization of metal spacecraft, complete with materialized living, breathing crewmen can occur. In addition, such things as Sasquatch, the Loch Ness Monster, and other tulpoids, materialized thought forms, are occasionally materialized, including imps, devils, angels, Virgin Mary, etc. Fortunately, the tuning, precise time synchronization of a great deal of a mind stuff, that results in such materializations is normally quite unstable, and so the materializations go away as the tuning fades, and the collection, kindling, subsides. In the model, any thought form in the human mind can be so kindled. The same sort of kindling creates life and consciousness also, as we will see in our next section. Figure 6 shows the Dennis Billings photo, a classic shot of a dematerializing spacecraft UFO tulpoid and an interpretation of the photograph in the diagram below. Mind, life, consciousness. In Figure 7, we show the relationship of mind, life, consciousness, and death as prescribed by the model. Briefly, each physical mass in the laboratory frame is simply the result of a localized crosstalk from all mind worlds, at any one instant, which mind world has furnished sufficient coherent crosstalk to breach from virtual, subquantum, to observable, quantum, state is a random variable. Therefore a normal physical object, while totally alive, is non-preferentially alive. Further, the cohering crosstalk from all virtual mind worlds accounts for the fact that each quantum change is totally statistical. Mass D illustrates such an inert mass. However, if a tuning coherence is established so that a slight preference is given to one of TT, a mind worlds, then a loop between the tuning body, for example, bodies A and B, and the preferred mind world is established as shown. This loop is two-way, quantum changes in S project only tiny portions into Sn, for example, and so many changes occur in body A on a random, statistical basis before their virtual crosstalk into Sn superposes sufficiently to breach the quantum threshold in Sn and result in a quantum change in Sn. Similarly, a great many quantum changes must occur in mind world Sn before their virtual projections. Crosstalk, into body A in frame S coheres, superposes, sufficiently to breach the threshold of quantum change in S, body A. The complete loop, A to Sn and Sn to A, defines what is called consciousness of A. A is the physical body, and Sn is the mind world. The three together, A, Sn, and the closed loop between A and Sn, define a living biosystem. Figure 8 shows such a biosystem in greater detail. Death is considered to be the loss of the closed loop between a biosystem's physical body tuner and its mind world. In Figure 7, SK represents a mind world severed from body C, and C and SK without a preferred closed loop represents the death of biosystem C. If, for example, body tuner C can be stimulated or shocked back into coherence with mind world S, then biosystem C can be restored to living functioning. An example is the stimulation of dead cells, that have been killed by ultraviolet light and allowed to stay dormant for even 24 hours, with visible light. In such case, the cells are shocked back into tuning resonance in many cases, and the dead cells will revive by the hundreds of thousands. In Figure 9, we clarify the time delay that results from the two-way kindling between a tuning body and its mind world. Many changes occur in the causal physical world frame, in the body, before crosstalk kindles a change into the mental frame, and many such kindled changes must occur in the biosystem's mind world before the feedback crosstalk. From those mind world changes can initiate a change in the biosystem's body in frame S. Thus human free will is severely limited, but present nonetheless. The great percentage of changes one's body experiences are statistical kindling inputs from other mind worlds and not under the control of the individual's own mind world. However, occasionally he does induce, incept, a control change into the otherwise statistical pattern. If enough behavior pattern is collected, these incepted changes are sufficient to deviate the biosystem from a purely statistical, inert behavior. Thus living behavior is recognizable in this fashion. The bulk of our experience involves the normal, statistical laws of ordinary inert physics, but a small part of our experience involves a deliberate, incepted deviation from those laws. Thus experience is largely like a rocket's trajectory. We cannot control the basic momentum and velocity of the trajectory, but can only deviate slightly from that trajectory. Indeed, inception, intent, consists of changing both the future and the past, as shown in Figure 10. It appears also that the fact that the past can be changed, in at least one sense, has now been established by Wheeler. Layers of unconsciousness. Actually, we have shown the simplest sort of life-mind loop, that loop between the biosystem's primary mind world and its tuning physical body. Other longer loops also exist, and these account for the existence of multiple layers of unconsciousness. For example, we may take any subset of human biosystems that have some specified similarity: race, culture, family, nation, area, creed, etc. In this case, the multiplex of mind worlds that corresponds to the subset also have a slightly favored, overall crosstalk loop between the mind worlds of the members of the subset. Therefore, each of these subsets forms a special sort of biosystem of its own. These layers of unconsciousness are illustrated in Figure 11. At the species level, this biosystem effectively constitutes Jung's collective unconscious. The concept here differs slightly from that of Jung, however, since a very real, living sort of biosystem is involved in our model, literally, a being of very strange characteristics indeed. For example, in each of these subset biosystems, multiple simultaneous consciousness exists, which to a monocular conscious mind, perceiver-detector, appears unconscious. That is, to a monocular perceiver it is either monocularly conscious or unconscious, not monocularly conscious. Since it is multiply conscious, it appears not monocularly conscious, hence unconscious to the ordinary monocular conscious. Further, for every human member of a particular subset, an extra dimension appears in the multiply conscious entity biosystem that results from the subset. Just as connecting two cerebral halves in a single biosystem gains a third dimension, another dimension is added for each unit connected in the biosystem. Also, the inceptive power of the biosystem increases exponentially as the number of stages. This has been shown in a separate paper by the author to be energy out divided by energy in equals amplification factor power number of the stages of human subjects, multiplied by identity coefficient, factor of crosstalk. Where EO divided by EI equal energy out divided by energy in, overall amplification factor, AO is the amplification factor achieved by each stage, human being, N equal the number of human stages in the subset, and IC equal the identity coefficient, fraction of crosstalk, stage to stage in that loop. It is important to note that these layers of unconsciousness, multiply conscious minds, are not mutually exclusive, but greatly overlap. If one accepts the existence of the collective human unconscious as a living biosystem, 4 billion dimensional, then it is a living entity, indeed, a great superentity, of which our own personal consciousnesses, personal unconsciousnesses are parts. Thus each of us is a cell in this great entity. Let us tentatively call it ZARG. ZARG has unique characteristics. It is unconscious by definition, hence sleeping. Further, its conscious mind is fragmented into 4 billion pieces, our own personal consciousnesses. In psychology, fragmentation of the conscious mind is technically called dissociation, and severe dissociation classically defines psychosis. Thus ZARG may be considered totally insane. As we stated, ZARG is multidimensional. ZARG's unconscious simultaneously receives and identifies 4 billion different conscious and unconscious perceptions. Just as the human consciousness, in identifying two slightly different two-dimensional visual patterns gains the third dimension, ZARG gains an additional dimension for every additional person past the first one. So ZARG is at least about 4 multiplied by 10 power 9 dimensional. Finally, it is well known in parapsychology that the personal unconscious can affect matter, that is, it can change space-time itself, and we have shown a physical mechanism for this effect, kindling, in our model. Psychokinesis, poltergeist phenomena, etc. are direct examples. From equation 1, previously given, this effect increases exponentially as the number of stages or minds that are linked in an inceptive loop. Since ZARG has 4 multiplied by 10 power 9 link stages, this MNS that its psychokinetic materialization dematerialization powers are at least some 10 power 10 times as great as those of, say, Uri Geller when he is bending or breaking metal. Thus ZARG can pull the very stars out of orbit, disrupt the Earth or solar system, stop the Earth in its orbit, or even change the fundamental laws of nature itself. The physical universe, in our model, is quite literally simply thought that is common to all minds, hence to all-mindedness or the creative mind, or whatever term one prefers to use for the infinite. It is the fact that the thought form of the physical frame is prescribed and re-prescribed, over and over, that lends it its seeming solidity as compared to the phenomena existing in only a single consciousness mind world. But the physical universe is totally mind stuff nonetheless. As such, it can indeed be changed by the proper resonance in a large number of stages, as given by formula. Thus ZARG contains so many mind world stages dimensions that it has a very powerful part to play in the reality or type of functioning exhibited by this particular physical universe. Indeed, a large part of the physical laws of nature and the stability of this space-time continuum is due to and prescribed by ZARG. Thus anything which powerfully affects the multiplistic mind of ZARG can stimulate actual changes in our own physical reality, essentially of any type and any degree, given a sufficiently strong stimulus. Dreams and the collective unconscious. Just as a personal dream can be psychoanalyzed to reveal the unresolved stresses and conflicts in the personal unconscious, the materialized dreams of the collective unconscious, that is, the tulpa manifestations, can be psychoanalyzed to reveal the unresolved stresses and conflicts in the collective unconscious. However, in analyzing the tulpoidal materializations and manifestations, one must seek out stress situations that exist between two or more large groups of people, in fact, between great nations. Since World War II, the major such stress on the collective unconscious has been the Cold War. Thus the UFO tulpoid phenomena psychologically should reveal significant aspects of the Cold War, and we will incorporate conventional psychological analysis and knowledge of the Soviet development of new superweapons, virtual state engineering, psychotronic weaponry, to show a fit to the major UFO phenomena. First, we summarize briefly THT mechanism for tulpoidal materialization. Figures 12 and 13 show how the unresolved stresses in large groupings of people filter deep into the layers of collective unconscious, increasing the psychokinetic ability attached to the unrelieved stresses, and ultimately resulting in psychokinetic pop-out or even full materialization. In the diagrams, drawn by Hal Crawford especially for this theoretical exposition, the increasingly deep layers are represented by layers A, B, C, etc. These represent city, country, ethnic, cultural, national, etc. level groupings and functional biosystems. From these concepts we will seek to fit the major unidentified flying object waves since World War II, including ghost rockets, waves of the 50s, waves of the 60s, the 1973 wave, and cattle mutilations. The Cold War, psychotronics, and UFOs. During World War II, Stalin laid plans to attack the West within about 2 years after the war's end. He knew that, when the war was over, the decadent capitalists would immediately beat their swords into plowshares and disarm, for they had always done so after each war. So he could hold his own forces ready until this occurred, then take Europe in 6 weeks. However, the advent of the US atomic bomb frustrated this plan. He could no longer mass his forces, for American bombers loaded with atomic bombs could have simply obliterated them. Consequently, Stalin had to change the plan and the time schedule for the attack. During 1946 to 1947, then, the Communists were intensively revising the master plan and hatching the plans for a global Cold War, rescheduling an eventual attack and takeover. Within a long-range, worldwide, strategic plan. So during this time, a great deal of threat stress, quite heavy pressure, was pressing down into the unconsciousnesses of a large number of Soviet communists. This constituted a heavy pressure on the collective unconscious of all humanity, and pop-outs, tulpoidal forms, of appropriate archetypes started pressing up through the successive layers of unconsciousness above the species unconscious. These successive layers modulate and shape the pattern of psychokinetic reality that is pushing up, much like different frequencies add together in Fourier analysis to compose the final form that emerges. Let us pause to analyze some factors bearing on these shapings that were occurring. The human unconscious is deepest ingrained with the experience of the ancient jungle days of millions of years ago, not recent history. In the human old experience that is in our genes, the male went where the threat or action was, to war or to the hunt, while the female stayed behind in the cave or fortress with the children, protected. Also, in the primates the erect penis is a sign of domination. Dominant monkeys erect and mount other male monkeys to show dominance. The erect mid-flanger is still a hostile gesture, and one of defiance and domination. Further, fire is a power symbol to the collective unconscious. Fire was power over fierce animal enemies, for it kept the tigers and leopards at bay. So all the threat saturation from the Soviets in 1946 to 1947 should give a male penis symbol, and include the fire symbol, etc. in adjacent areas, where the threat or action is. Power and domination should be symbolized, and the symbol expressed should be the one most appropriately selected from the higher levels of unconsciousness, that is, the final pattern of the original archetype would be determined by their modulations. And in the higher, shallower levels of unconsciousness, the German use of the V-1 and V-2 rockets in World War II had been strongly imprinted, for use of these weapons had fired the imagination of the world. We point out that a rocket is a male penis symbol par excellence, and also has fire in its tail to symbolize dominance. So in 1946 to 1947 the erect penis IR symbol, for dominance, threat, and power, ought to pop out where the action is, that is, closest to the threat or war-threatening agent or zone. And indeed it did, as ghost rockets in the skies over the Scandinavian countries next to the Soviet Union, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, etc. Figure 14. But the US is a natural fortress, or so it had always been, with two great ocean barriers east and west and no strong enemy north or south. That corresponds to the cave fortress protected place, and thus a female symbol should result in the US. Again, so it did. In June 1947 Kenneth Arnold, flying over the state of Washington, the state closest to the Soviet Union at the time, encountered flying saucers, which were simply female mandalas modulated by our science fiction Buck Rogers' national cultural unconsciousness. Arnold's personal unconscious, the last modulator and shaper, tuner, of the reality format that materialized, is that of a pilot. So flying saucers are what appeared over the United States, not ghost rockets. Make no mistake, these tulpoids are actual materializations, not hallucinations or fantasies. Jung has pointed out the psychological and psychic content of the flying saucer phenomenon, but here we are speaking of materialized projections from the collective unconscious, and we have briefly summarized the actual physics of such materializations. This author, of course, is not the first to have considered UFOs to be extradimensional or psychic projections. Vallée and Keel have certainly pointed out the other than simple extraterrestrial nature of UFOs, and Hynek has voiced his conclusion that we may be dealing with a new reality. Several major waves of UFOs occurred in the 1950s, and these of course coincide with significant events of the Korean War in 1950, 1951, 1952, and 1953. Other waves continued to occur as stresses in the Cold War were periodically increased. Another example is the wave of 1967, the forgotten wave of UFOs, which occurred in the same year as the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. The 1967 war was a major test in the continuing Cold War, and the UFO wave of 1967 was the fourth largest wave in history. In 1973 the Yom Kippur War occurred. This was the Soviet Union's Spanish Civil War, where the final tactics and equipment for anti-tank and anti-aircraft weaponry were tested against the superb Israeli tankers and flyers. In addition, figures for the loss rates of tanks and aircraft in modern warfare were obtained, and the effect on the US and NATO of the cutoff of Arab oil was tested. Further, when the Israelis at one point succeeded in cutting off an Egyptian army, Brezhnev notified the United States president over the hotline that the Soviets were going in, and the US could do as it pleased. The Soviets loaded 7 airborne divisions in readiness to send in, and the US loaded its single airborne division, ready for insertion. For several days, the world teetered on the brink of direct ground confrontation between the Soviet Union and the US, with all its possible dangerous consequences. Now ground confrontation is contact. And UFO contactee cases involve confrontation. In the very month, October, that the 1973 Yom Kippur War erupted, the greatest wave of UFO contactee cases in history broke out in the United States. Further, in the shallower unconscious levels above the collective species unconscious, which were modulating and molding the reality format, the imagination of the world had been captured by the spacesuit astronauts who had walked on the moon. So most US contactee cases involved spacesuit beings, conditioned into that framework by the national cultural modulation. Some of the contactee cases involved robots or metallic men, analogous to the mechanista and robotry of the US space program. And here in the US, the fortress, the female mandala craft symbol was generally maintained. In many of these contactee cases, examinations of the contactees' private persons were conducted, symbolic of the detailed examination the Soviets were making of US equipment, tactics, oil and economics, vital parts, etc. We do not infer that a painstaking analysis of each and every notable incident in every major wave has been performed by this author. I have certainly not had time for such a massive undertaking. I merely wish to point out that indeed the phenomena can be psychoanalyzed to at least some degree of success, based on the theory developed and the idea of stress-evoked materialized tulpoids from the collective unconscious, symbolizing major or critical events and periods in the Cold War. And I would urge those UFO researchers who are qualified in psychological analysis to take the examples given and go much further, and indeed to continue the psychological analysis of the UFO phenomena in terms of the Cold War and induced tulpoid materializations. Cattle mutilations. Within the last several years, a rather fantastic number of paranormal cattle mutilations have occurred across the United States. A peak has apparently been centered in and around Colorado, the home of Cheyenne Mountain, in whose bosom the heart or control center for the strategic retaliatory forces of the United States is nestled. That is significant, for it is the heart of the United States, which is to be slashed and eviscerated, in the Soviet plan. But to explain the cattle mutilations, some additional factors must be developed. Virtual state engineering, psychotronics, or what the Soviets call energetics, ironically was born in the United States, with the Radland energy amplifier built by T. Hiari Morey of Salt Lake City, Utah before World War II. A Soviet agent obtained the secret of that device in 1939, and personally destroyed the only existing Morey device. The device was exceedingly difficult to build, however, and Soviet work with it was interrupted by World War II. When checked in his plan to attack at the close of World War II, Stalin called in his scientists and told them the destiny of communism had been frustrated by this great United States technical breakthrough. Further, this would not be the last great breakthrough. However, he informed them in no uncertain terms, the next great breakthrough of that magnitude had better be Soviet in origin. Thus they were to follow every field of human knowledge, no matter how strange or unorthodox, and intensely search for such another breakthrough area. No stone was to be left unturned in this search. Once the field was discovered, they would intensely develop superweapons in secret, just as the United States had done, and spring them by surprise on the West, just as the United States had done on Japan. Ironically, we had showed Stalin the scenario by means of which the West could eventually be overcome. In the interim, the guerrilla tactics of terrorism and insurgency, and unrelenting pressure, that had proven so successful in the Russian Revolution were to be launched around the world on an international scale. In all continents, small conventional wars and guerrilla wars would bleed the United States dragon and weaken it. The Soviet Union would also embark on a massive crash program to establish defenses against bomber attack, develop the atomic bomb, and develop the new rocket weapons and jet aircraft the Germans had so brilliantly demonstrated in World War II, and the new atomic weapons unfurled by the United States. So in 1947 the Cold War was launched, and the Soviet path to eventual world domination was clearly spelled out. The reader is assumed to be familiar with the major events of the Cold War since then, and it is stressed that, since about 1972, the Soviets have greatly accelerated their procurement and stockage of new arms and equipment, and Soviet production of war materiel has risen to feverish levels not reached by any other nation since Adolf Hitler's production peak just prior to his initiation of World War II. In the 1930s and 1940s, I've succeeded in deriving Einstein's postulates of relativity, Newton's laws of motion, and the law of universal gravitation from a more fundamental Lorentz invariant ether theory. This work was picked up by the Soviet Union, and is part of the fundamentals of their theory of energetics, virtual state engineering, today. In 1957 Everett's Many Worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics was published by Princeton University. If one meticulously examines this theory, and if one regards a mental object as just an ordinary physical object whose time dimension is synonymous with the time dimension of ordinary physical objects, but whose spatial dimensions do not intersect spatially with the spatial dimensions of ordinary objects, then one realizes that minds are just ordinary physical worlds 3 or more orthogonal spatial turns away from the ordinary laboratory 3 space, and cotemporal with it. This is particularly likely to be noticed if one has the dialectical method, a slightly confused way of stating the fourth law of logic, deeply ingrained in his thinking. The Soviet theoreticians have such an outlook, and they made the connection. Psychotronic, virtual state engineering, weapons which were well along in development but in difficulties because of inadequate theory were rapidly brought to fruition. Here we only give a succinct summary of some of the highlights of that weapons program. A fuller and more theoretical treatment has been given by the author in several sources. So in 1960 Khrushchev, speaking to the Presidium, to the leaders of the Communist Party, not for propaganda, stated at the conclusion of his report that the Soviet Union had a new weapon, just within the portfolio of its scientists, which was so powerful that, if unrestrainedly used, it could wipe out all life on Earth. That is, intensive psychotronic weapon development was underway in the Soviet Union. At about the same time, complex, weak microwave radiation of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow began. The purpose was to modulate psychotronic, virtual state, patterns onto weak radio frequency carriers, and irradiate a very high-level U.S. target, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. This would guarantee the personal attention of the United States President, Central Intelligence Agency, DIA, NSA, State Department, National Security Council, etc. A few blood changes and diseases would be introduced as a red herring. By the U.S. response to the microwave radiation, the state of U.S. knowledge of the new breakthrough area, psychotronics, could be positively ascertained, because the decision for the response would come from the highest levels in the U.S. government. If the U.S. reacted only to the electromagnetic component, it would show with 100% certainty that the U.S. knew nothing of psychotronics, and hence had not developed psychotronic superweapons in secret. If the U.S. reacted to the psychotronic modulation, it would show that the U.S. possessed a knowledge of psychotronics, and the specific type of reaction would indicate the sophistication of that knowledge, hence the probable nature of weaponry they might have developed. Since the beginning of this radiation of the U.S. Embassy, we have been reassuring the Soviets we know nothing about the mechanism for their new superweapons. Just how vital this strange intelligence probe is to the Soviet Union can be ascertained from the fact that 4 American presidents have asked them to stop the radiation, but they have not done so, merely reducing the power level to a seemingly insignificant level, which psychotronically necessitates only a little extra kindling time to accomplish the same results. Khrushchev, ever the ebullient peasant, quickly attempted to move strategic rocket weapons into Cuba and immediately change the balance of power, before his new superweapons were operationally deployed. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis thus caught him without his new superweapons and with his missiles in woeful operational shape. Hence he simply had to back down and withdraw the missiles from Cuba, a serious loss of face. In the communist framework, and one which Khrushchev must have known surely spelled his demise unless drastic recoterie could be made. And to recoup his status and circumvent his imminent downfall, Khrushchev, this author contends, staged a dramatic 1-2 punch in early 1963, as soon as his new superweapons became operationally deployed. On April 10 the Thresher nuclear submarine was killed from a secret Soviet psychotronic laboratory, and on April 11 a nuclear explosion of possibly 1 megaton yield was successfully transmitted through hyperspace from the Soviet Union, probably from Semipalatinsk, from the so-called particle beam facility, to an underwater point about 100 miles north of Puerto Rico. Today third-generation psychotronic weapons are probably deployed and ready in the Soviet Union. Ironically, in psychotronic devices the flow, background, of orthotational flux in which coherence is multistagedly established must be relative soit uniform, isotropic, for the coherence to be maintained and for the superweapons to work. Occasionally, for random intervals of from 15 minutes to even 2 to 3 weeks, turbulent flux is encountered, destroying the coherence and rendering the superweapons inoperable. All weapons of a given type cease working simultaneously, and all resume again together, something totally different from any normal weapons system failure mode. If flux is sufficiently turbulent, for example, all psychotronic weapons fail. Large nuclear explosions, for example, apparently cause such flux turbulence. Hence the superweapons cannot be absolutely depended upon for the primary effectors, but are best used by surprise initially and as a backup, preferably with mind-stunning shock and devastation, just as the US used the atomic bombs on Japan. So for that reason the Soviet buildup in conventional and nuclear arms has aimed at overwhelming strength in those categories, even though the superweapons exist and are deployed and ready. The greatest armada of weaponry in history has continued to be steadily built up by the Soviet Union. The attack operation is poised and ready. A lightning blow of unprecedented ferocity and speed, followed by a massive, mind-paralyzing, awesome devastation of our own strategic weapons, cities, and industrial centers by the Soviet psychotronic superweapons, is imminent. The Soviet plan has always been simple and three-phased. 1. Secure the Eurasian continent by defeating NATO and annihilating Red China, ejecting the US presence, and taking over Europe. This requires 3 to 6 days, and most strategic analysts I know of now concede the Soviet Union can do this. In the process, just as the United States president is contemplating full nuclear strategic retaliation, say, after 50% casualties in NATO in the first 3 days, a SWAT ground advance of 250 kilometers, Soviet seizure of total air superiority in the first several hours, and unrelenting merciless air attack has devastated critical installations, supplies, centers, and forces throughout the NATO rear, the psychotronic weapons will be unleashed. The SAC bases, the strategic missile sites, and the industrial eastern US will lie in smoking ruins within minutes after the initiation of the onslaught, and the nuclear submarines on station will rupture like popping balloons in the same few minutes. The West will be totally paralyzed, just as the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki paralyzed a fanatical Japan in World War II. 2. Split the American continent in two, seizing South America and the Panama Canal. The Cubans are the stars of this phase, and that is why they have been involved in 15 or so countries to gain experience. Angola, so to speak, was the dress rehearsal for the Cuban forces for their forthcoming role in Central and South America. A devastated US will be unable to interfere with the Cubans. The US and Canada and Mexico, isolated and cut off, with the great industrial centers gone, and with severe devastation everywhere, then collapse in total chaos and economic and social destitution. Soviet forces then simply move in to restore order, with only a few sporadic small mopping up actions necessary. Now if all this incredible scenario has any validity, then after the final weapons rehearsal, that is, after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, one ought to see an increase in the tulpoidal phenomena of a sharply symbolic nature which can be appropriately psychoanalyzed. And so it has happened, and so one can do the analysis. The cow is the Western female symbol par excellence. Western children nurse on cow's milk, so to speak. So if the fortress is going to be violated, then one ought to see the female symbol being violated and mutilated. So cattle mutilations of a mysterious, paranormal nature have been occurring all across the U.S. From the East Coast out east through Colorado, Utah, and Montana, several thousand by now. It is not our purpose here to give individual case incidents, the literature already contains sufficient details. We simply summarize some of the aspects, and briefly present their analysis. Teats are cut off, the children of the West shall lose their sustenance. Lips, ears, and tongue are removed, freedom of speech and hearing shall be excised. Sexual organs removed, there shall be no more fruit of the womb in the West. Sharp, surgical excisions are made, the operation shall be accomplished incisively and with surgical precision. Zigzag cuts have sometimes been used, deception shall be used as to direction and intent. Usually the blood is totally drained, something that cannot be done even with hypodermic needles and pumps. The lifeblood of the Fortress West shall be totally drained, and by other than normal means. The edges of the cuts are sometimes seared as if by a laser. The laser is symbolic of futuristic weaponry. To the unconscious, advanced, futuristic weapons, psychotronic weapons, shall seal the end. The cattle mutilations are materialized precognitive nightmares indicating the horror of the Armageddon to come, and these nightmarish paranormal mutilations reveal the true nature of our times. Yet no orthodox scientist or governmental agency is equipped or able to deal with a phenomenon such as this. Indeed, most of our own UFO researchers are little equipped to deal with it, but to their credit they keep gathering data in the face of a great deal of derision and even hostility. In ancient times the wise men knew how to do a metapsychological analysis of the tulpoidal materializations, the portents, signs and wonders, from the collective unconscious, which in those days centered about the foci of power, the kings and high rulers. It was not foolish to be concerned with strange, precognitive dreams that were foisted upon a king, nor was it foolish to interpret strange aerial phenomena in terms of serious threats looming over the horizon. Ironically, today we are in much better condition to separate out the strange but normal phenomena, such as meteors and comets, and collect the hardcore residue that represent the tulpoid materializations, but we have no wise men skilled in metapsychological analysis of such phenomena. Again, one of this author's purposes is to raise the issue and urge qualified psychologists and psychiatrists to analyze the data and the tulpoidal manifestations in the light of the major stress on the human race, the Cold War. A final numbing possibility. If the next Great War is truly upon us, then the horror and devastation that will occur make every other war in history pale by comparison. For today even our nuclear armaments are sufficient to ensure that hundreds of millions of people die within the first hour or two of full-scale initiation. The survival of mankind itself literally is at stake. Accordingly, the stress factor bearing upon the collective human unconscious is higher than at any time in our previous history. For that reason, just prior to the actual Soviet attack against NATO, the tulpoidal symbology should be raised to the absolute highest possible degree. and there would seem to be only one additional female symbol higher than the cow, that is the human female. So in horror one realizes the possibility of raising the cattle mutilations to the last final step, the paranormal mutilation of the human female. Indeed, several candidates for such incidents may already have occurred, but this researcher has been unable, and indeed unwilling, to obtain sufficient data on any of them to validate the possibility. And one other feature of the mutilation incidents needs to be painfully brought out. Other animals have been mutilated, besides cattle. In one incident a young male horse was mutilated, and of course emasculated. Here the symbology is direct: the youth, the young soldiers, will be emasculated, helpless before the onslaught at first of the Warsaw Pact hordes and immediately thereafter of the Soviet psychotronic superweapons. Also, we point out that in the old human experience, the women and the children stayed behind in the protected fortress. So in addition to the cattle, female, mutilations, we should have been experiencing small animal mutilations, symbolic of the children. Indeed, so we have, though it has largely not been connected to the UFO phenomena by most analysts. But many dogs, cats, squirrels, rabbits, etc. have also been paranormally mutilated. The escalation of this symbolic chain, of course, poses the horrible possibility of incidents of paranormal mutilation of actual human children. In science, a researcher strives to remain unemotionally involved, unattached, and unbiased. But any research directly involving human beings, there is always a point at which scientific detachment must yield to human consideration, and this metapsychiatric analysis is such a point, beyond all question, for this researcher. Today, as it was when I first wrote these words in early 1977, the pen, the heart, and the hand that writes the words are deeply shaken. Indeed, I continue to fervently hope that the model and analyses may be totally in error. Yet my military background assures me we have already entered the period of no return for the next World War, and it could literally be initiated almost at any moment. And the entire result of over 14 years of unrelenting effort and analysis in the paranormal field convinces me that the model and the analysis ring true, regardless of the human terror, suffering, and misery revealed by these modern-day tulpoidal signs and portents of that which is to come. Conclusion. There is much more that can be taken from the model and principles presented, but the remainder is beyond the scope of this presentation. Strangely enough, the end result of the analysis turns out to be a happy ending for humankind, for the model predicts the mind linkage of all humanity into a great, superdimensional, unlimited being totally transcending our present ideas of space and time limitation. That eventuality has been presented elsewhere by the author. The basic facts we wish to leave with the reader are these: it is possible to extend our present logic along the lines indicated, and add a fourth law which completes and closes Aristotelian logic. With the four-law logic, a thing can be modeled in terms of its mutually exclusive opposite. By this means, the mind can be modeled in terms of physics. A physics, Everett's many universes interpretation of quantum mechanics, is readily available for this approach, but the physics is so eerie and strange that it has been almost totally ignored. Nonetheless, it is totally consistent with the entire present experimental basis of physics. The model presented, then, is generally consistent with the principles of quantum mechanics, and extends them to allow for multiple simultaneous perception. The model of mind and mind levels that results encompasses the collective human unconscious as a living being, and addresses its unusual characteristics, which transcend ordinary space and time limitations. The model presents mechanisms for almost every sort of paranormal phenomenon and parapsychological phenomenon presently investigated. Included are theoretical mechanisms, physics, for UFOs as tulpoidal materializations projected from the collective human unconsciolus, initiated by stress is in large masses of people. As tulpoids, the UFO phenomena are capable of being psychoanalyzed in terms of the Cold War, or at least a large percentage of the phenomena fit that prescription. One additional factor, the Soviet development of secret, psychotronic superweapons, is necessary to fully complete the analysis. Again, we do not wish to present this work as finished. Instead, it is only just begun. However, we do point out that the theory is directly applicable to practical devices, and that one or more devices operating along these lines has actually been built. Finally, we wish to stress the importance of recognition of virtual state as a complete kind of reality already used in physics, and the necessity for earnest study and experiment toward the ability to directly engineer the virtual state itself. If one can control the virtual state, one can control all electric charge and electromagnetics, hence all chemistry and all physical effects and interactions. We also urge an end to the resistance to the study of mind in physics. Quantum mechanics itself has long since reduced physics to the study of the relations between perceptions. Indeed, it has nothing at all to say about a possible concrete world lying behind its equations, as Margina and Lindsay pointed out. To our colleagues in the study of UFO phenomena, we point out that, literally, the present model includes all others. The model predicts the existence of every kind of reality format imaginable, and various of these formats are continually being stimulated. Thus we can actually get visitors from the stars, from a particular alternate reality format, hard-nosed spaceships with steel hulls, space-suited astronauts, little humanoids, robotic figures, Sasquatch-like figures, angelic beings, impish beings, etc. And yet we also can get simply nocturnal lights, which still comprise the bulk of the phenomena. Finally, we point out that mechanisms for almost all aspects of the UFO phenomena, including disabling of vehicles and communications, activation of Geiger counters, paralysis of contacts, the unreal and dreamy feeling that accompanies contact, etc. are derivable and have been presented. Finally, we urge our colleagues, many of whom are more qualified than this author, to pursue phenomenon this line that so endeavor far has resisted in our continuing our best analytical UFO efforts along conventional worldwide UFO lines. The phenomenon definitely involves both mind and matter, and unless we can present a scientific model of mind and matter and their interaction, consistent with the present experimental basis of physics and extending it, we cannot hope to have a science that can be applied to the UFO phenomenon and explain it.